Thought it was just one.
Okay, if everybody could take their seat, we'll get started.
The message mark here about
I want to welcome everyone to the 2018 annual meeting of our Alumni Association. I'm Phyllis Flaherty. I became president in November. So if things don't go as smoothly as when Bob was president, you'll know why. And it might be, I can't see my notes. I had cataract surgery Monday, and I understand that's like one of those things everybody goes through. Anyway, I retired in 2011 after 35 years at EPA, and I was happy to discover there was an alumni association. Now, I don't know if all of you already know this, but the Alumni Association was started by Chuck Elkins and Lynn Miller in 2008. So at that time, I guess it was the two of you. And today, I'm happy to report that we have 1,747 members, which I don't check. We had 256 members join this year. So a big thank you to our membership committee, to EPA for including information on our association, and to all of you that invited colleagues. Now, some say we're benefiting from the current political climate. Speaking of which, we have three panelists to give their views on the current political climate regarding the environment, its protection, and the future. And so we're going to start with them in a few minutes. And after a Q&A session, we're going to announce our board members. So we're reversing that part of the program and talk briefly about our volunteer table and some great opportunities for you to get involved. And before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank Sidley Austin for hosting us, and a special thanks to Richard Alonso for being our contact. And Rich is an EPA alumni who used to also be in OECA. We very much appreciate being hosted in such luxurious surroundings. Sure.
So I guess I kind of inherited this from Roger Martella. We've been hosting you folks for some time now, and we welcome you to Sidley. You guys are always welcome here. One of the best years of my life was obviously at EPA. I started in, I guess, 1996 and left in 2007 to go into private practice. And I've been here at Sidley for a year. Andrew Stewart, another EPA alumni of ours. And you were there from?
I was in OECA with Rich from 03 to like 2015.
So 2003 to 2015. And I think right now, we probably here at Sidley have more EPA and DOJ alumni than any other law firm in DC. So that's something that we're kind of proud of. But I think we're the only two EPA folks, right, that are alumni. Everybody else is DOJ, those litigators. So we let them do all the work, and we just have all the fun stuff. But anyway, thank you all. Have a great meeting. And again, welcome. And, hope you guys enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to introduce our speakers very briefly because I think most of you know them. We have Linda Fisher, who most recently was with DuPont, but prior to that was in a number of political positions at EPA, everything from deputy administrator, assistant administrator in the Office of Pesticide and Toxic Substances, where I work for, assistant administrator in Office of Policy Planning and Evaluation, and chief of staff to the EPA administrator. I think in an oral history I saw when I Google everybody, it said EPA Administrator William K. Riley described Fisher as one of his ablest people, proving to be a star as his assistant administrator for toxics and pesticides. Sitting next to her is Elizabeth Sjogren, who is a reporter for Reveal with the Center for Investigative Reporting, covering science and environmental issues. She's covered environmental issues for NPR, High Country News, and the LA Times. And we also have Mike Walsh, who was also at EPA from, I believe, 1974 to 1981, dealing with motor vehicle pollution control efforts. Since then, he's been an independent technical consultant on vehicle emission standards, and he received a Genius Grant in 2005 from the MacArthur Fellowship Program. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my speakers. What I'm going to ask them to do is each speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and at the end of that, we'll take questions from the audience so we can have a good discussion about EPA's future and where we are now. Thank you. Linda, would you like to go first?
I knew if I looked at Phyllis to say who was going first, she'd pick on me. So nice to see so many people here. I am actually kind of chuckling to myself. A number of you came up to me to say, oh, I can't wait to hear what you have to say. And I was immediately thinking, well, you used to tell me what to say. Where are you when I need you? You know, we could spend a lot of time talking about how painful it is to read the newspapers every day about EPA. That's what cocktail hour is all about. I will have to miss that because I actually have to leave here at 7. But if you are like me, and I'm sure many of you are, it gets very difficult to read the newspaper. And it's troublesome because there's kind of the world divides in 2 sets of very important issues. The first is the ethical issues. And many of you were at EPA when it was brought to its knees under a different administration. But that was when people seemed to care about ethical issues. And I'm hard-pressed to find people up on Capitol Hill that do these days. But there are a lot of those. To tell you the truth, my biggest concern is there's too much focus on the ethical issues. And the public policy issues are getting lost in the press. So I'm going to be very excited to see what Elizabeth has to say. Because I worry that we get swamped, wrong word, that we get a flood of information about stuff that, you know, Scott Pruitt's doing or whatever, and I worry that people get overwhelmed with that and they don't pay enough attention to some of the public policy issues and some of the institutional changes that are underway that I have some concerns about. So I did want to talk. So those are kind of my big picture in terms of where the political world is. EPA. I don't have any more insight than anyone here does who's reading the newspaper and listening to the news. So, but there are some points I wanted to make and then open it up to the others, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion today. I do feel that some of what this administration has done is they have slashed the budget and taken on head-on a lot of the programs that we all care about. Is they've kind of pulled the Band-Aid off some issues that I actually think have been festering for a while. And as the question comes to where do you see EPA in the future, I think there are some issues that people need to take a very serious look at. The first one, no particular order, one is the role of science in public policy and the governorship or the stewardship of science. And it's easy for all of us to read the newspaper about how horrible the Trump administration is on climate, and yes, they are. But every single one of us was with EPA and made very tough decisions, and we all know there's been a growing abuse of the science for a long time. And it's on all sides. It's on all sides. And I think it's been taken to a very new level that is hard to even imagine. But I do think that when you think about the future of, I'm going to say environmental protection, not just EPA, how do you get the most current and the best science and scientific decision-making into the agency's public policy? And how do you protect the agency decision-makers from the external and sometimes internal pressures around science? I came from 2 companies that were very active in bringing agriculture biotechnology to the market, and I personally feel there's been huge abuse by many activists around the science on agriculture biotechnology. So I think it's a really critical issue. I think, as I said, the travesty of how climate has been dealt with is bringing forward an issue that probably needed a lot deeper discussion a while back. Second one, and some of you that have been involved in EPN, which I will give a plug for now, the focus of this administration has been on drastic budget cuts. I think there's a legitimate issue for, does EPA have the right organizational structure going forward in the future? When EPA was created, when the 10 regions were created, we had 50 weak or non-existent state programs. That is not the case today. All states aren't equally strong, for sure, and that changes with politics. But as I look across at least the corporate world, there is no corporation today that is structured the same as it was in 1970 and would call itself efficient. And I do think how EPA is structured, what is the appropriate role between the states and headquarters, or the headquarters and the regions on all issues, is something that, probably needs a real serious look as we go forward. What's the value add? What's the additional environmental protection for the current structure, and could we do it better? Another question that Phyllis and Chuck asked us to focus on, and I'm just hitting big stuff so the others can talk. How do you rebuild the agency's reputation? I think it's a great question. I think it's been an erosion for several years. I think the toll of, again, the activists always criticizing EPA, industry always criticizing EPA, the states always criticizing EPA. There are very few times when people stand up and say EPA did a great job and they got it right. And I think that no one was paying attention while the reputation of EPA was being eroded. It might have been well intended. I remember meeting with the Green Group once when I was deputy, saying if all you do is tell the world how bad we are, people are going to wonder, do you even need an EPA? If we're not protecting them, and industry says we're causing people jobs, eventually people will question, why do we even need the agency? And I worry that, fast forward a decade and a half, and you've got a lot of folks in the public saying, they messed up the water supply in Flint, and, we're either protected too much or not enough. And I think in the daily life of busy people, EPA can lose its standing. And I worry about that. And I think that's something we all should be figuring out, how you build the reputation of the agency. I think it gets back maybe to some of the issues I talked about earlier. Other things I think need to be thought about as we move forward. What's the role of technology in things, particularly around enforcement and monitoring and reporting? We built up a structure of reporting, monitoring, and compliance before anybody had technology. More is being done, and I think as you look to the future, there might be some opportunities there. And the last one, and this is dear to my heart, and I am not here to be an apologist for industry, but there is a huge effort inside industry to bring more sustainable technologies to the market. And whether it is in agriculture, in energy efficiency, in water efficiency, there's a huge amount of an effort, initiative, and R&D in the private sector to make the world more sustainable, to identify the technologies that will feed the world, that will provide energy to the world, that will shelter the world, that are significant step changes. And I, in my own mind, have wondered, what is EPA's role in driving sustainable solutions as opposed to just, protecting the environment or reducing pollution? I personally would like to see EPA play a bigger role in solution-oriented issues and not limit itself, even though it is a very important role, but not limit itself to just be a pollution prevention and enforcement agency. And lastly, I will say one of the reasons I think that we need efforts like Dan Fiorino is leading at AU, many of you know about that. Indiana University is doing a project also around the future of EPA. All of these I think are really critical, but they underscore the fact that we no longer have congressional oversight. And you used to be able to have discussions around some of these bigger issues that I've thrown out there in congressional hearings. They may or may not have been comfortable for all of us to be participating in, but at least you had Congressional Research Service, Office of Technology Assessment, and a lot of the committee staffs kind of asking these bigger questions. And I think without Congress doing its job, there's a lack of a forum for people to really hash through some of the big public policy issues, and we missed that. So, Dan, congratulations on your initiative, and the folks at IU and some other schools. I'm sure we'll get into it as we go forward. So those are my opening comments.
Need a volunteer to go next.
Draft somebody like you did me.
Okay, I'll dive in. I first started covering the Environmental Protection Agency at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. At that time, I was working for the LA Times, and maybe I talked to some of you then. One of the first reporting trips I took was to farms to learn about manure and water pollution. I had recently switched from covering the White House beat, a decision that baffled my parents. I remember overhearing my mother telling some family friends, "Elizabeth used to fly around the world on Air Force One with the President of the United States, and now she covers poop. And she likes it." My mom was right. I was hooked. It didn't matter what the topic was, if it was TMDLs or New Source Review or a lot of other stuff that nobody in the public knew what it was. I was endlessly curious, and still am, in all the programs that you worked so hard to develop at the Environmental Protection Agency. And one of the stories that caught my interest early on was the 2001 Supreme Court ruling known as Swank. And it, as maybe everybody knows, it limited wetlands and streams that are protected by the federal government. I traveled around the country and wrote about what was at stake in how the EPA implemented that rule way back then. Fast forward to today, and the fate of wetlands and streams is still in dispute. The EPA finally drafted a rule under President Obama, and it was being challenged in the courts even before President Trump took over. Now, as you maybe all know, Administrator Pruitt is determined to gut it. I think the fate of this policy shows how difficult it has been for the EPA to do its job of protecting people and nature at a time when Congress gives the agency almost no direction. With few exceptions, Congress has been too polarized on environmental issues to act ever since I started covering the environment. There are notable exceptions, of course, like the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, which increased fuel economy standards for cars and boosted renewable fuels. And then in 2016, the reforms to the Toxic Substances Control Act, a law that failed to give EPA enough power to effectively regulate harmful chemicals. When President Obama signed Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, then EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy flagged it as the first major update to an environmental statute in 20 years. That said it all. Congress has remained silent on the biggest environmental challenge facing the planet, climate change. With President Obama's lead, the EPA did its best to craft major programs to address the problem. The agency adopted aggressive standards to rein in pollution from cars and the Clean Power Plan after years of working on it. But those programs are endangered now by the Trump administration, as are so many other policies and regulations that the EPA put into effect with all of your work. And at this point, environmental groups are busy in court trying to protect these policies, but they're very vulnerable because Congress didn't mandate them, not explicitly. Even in this era, it's my view that EPA officials are still playing very important roles. Last fall, and at least as my stories show me. Last fall, when I was working for High Country News, I was writing a story about a proposed city-sized housing development south of Tucson called the Villages at Vigneto. A developer wants to build 30,000 homes in the desert. Under the Bush administration, during an earlier iteration of this project, EPA officials had warned that the best science showed that so much water would be pumped to serve this community that the arid Southwest's last major free-flowing river, the San Pedro, would no longer run year-round. A river won't flow year-round anymore because of this one project. And hundreds of migratory birds and countless other wildlife depend on the San Pedro because there's so little water in that part of the country. With the Trump administration in office, the Fish and Wildlife Service bowed to the pressure from the developer and reversed its vehement objections to the project. And I was the one who broke that story, so hence my interest. The EPA, however, in December, even under the Trump administration, told the Corps of Engineers that its concerns about the project's impacts to waters haven't changed. The letter was a little skimpy in details. However, the officials who wrote this letter in the public comments to the Corps of Engineers decision attached 3 very strongly worded letters written during the Bush administration, which detailed all the scientific information about the risks that this project posed to wildlife and to water resources. And now the fate of this rests at the Corps of Engineers, and as you maybe know, the EPA has veto authority on what happens to that project under the Corps of Engineers. And it's my thinking that EPA officials having, I think, the courage to voice their objections in that letter, even if it was very mildly worded, matter. And if Pruitt rewrites the Waters of the U.S. rules along the lines dictated by President Trump, future projects might not even have to seek permission to fill in streams like that. 51 acres of streams will be filled in by this project. And even consequences as dramatic as turning a permanent river like the San Pedro into an intermediate one won't even have a voice. What's more, Arizona supports the Villages of Vigneto and is asking Pruitt for the authority to decide for itself whether what wetlands and streams even need protection. For me, the story of the San Pedro River points to an important role that EPA officials play, and an important role that all of you can play. You understand what EPA's mission is better than anybody. You know the intricacies of EPA programs. You know what science is being scuttled and altered to justify these rollbacks. You know the likely impacts to people and nature. You spent your careers knowing these things. You know what dangerous pesticides and chemicals might get green lights from the EPA. You know what it will mean if the EPA stops using important studies when it regulates air pollution, chemicals, and pesticides. And you know what industrial polluters there are out there right now pumping the most hazardous air pollution into the air, into our communities. For many years, I've written about EPA's efforts to take on environmental challenges. Now I have a job with Reveal from the Center Investigative Reporting. My job is solely to find examples of ways that the federal government is ignoring, censoring, and defunding science, and tell stories about how these decisions are impacting communities and nature. And I'll put a little pitch in here. I'm eager for your advice and your guidance and your story ideas to help me tell the most important stories that Americans need to know about environmental protection and science. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mike?
Good evening. Chuck and Phyllis, thank you for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity and see some faces of people that I've known for many years, and it's nice to see them again. I work on motor vehicles, have my whole career. And since leaving EPA, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of that kind of work in different parts of the world. Do a lot of work in China and India and Europe, Brazil, Mexico, and other places. And we are, in my opinion, the envy of the world. Everyone around the world looks to EPA as the golden standard. And EPA has helped with that and put on workshops and training programs and a variety of things like that, distributing information. It used to be you could go to the EPA website and find anything about anything to do with the environment. And when I come back here, it's clear to me that we have the cleanest vehicles in the world by far. We have the strongest motor vehicle program in the world. Some of you have heard about the Dieselgate, the Volkswagen scandal. Europe has about 50% of their cars are diesel. We have about 5% of our cars are diesel, but we found the problem and found the solutions to the problem because we have an in-use vehicle focused program. I remember when I worked at EPA, we had our first mandatory recall of some Chrysler vehicles in 1975. Europe is just now trying to figure out how to deal with in-use vehicles and how to make their program a more mature and more effective program. And in doing that, the current head of the Mobile Source program, Chris Grundler, was over in Europe about a year ago, and the parliamentarians and others couldn't get enough of him. How did you do this? How did you do that? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? And Europe is dramatically upgrading its program as a result of looking at what EPA does and how they do it. So I say we have the cleanest vehicles in the world. I would say 15 years ago or maybe even less than that, we had the least efficient vehicles in the world and the highest polluting from a CO2 standpoint vehicles in the world. Up until the Supreme Court said that we could address climate change under the existing Clean Air Act, and then EPA became pretty active in addressing CO2 from vehicles. And if things don't change in the next few months, by 2025, EPA would then be up with the world leaders in terms of climate emissions and greenhouse gases. We still have clearly air pollution problems in this country in spite of how clean vehicles are. And EPA had been in the process of looking to the next generation, not so much cars, but trucks. There's another 90 or so % reduction in truck emissions that was on the radar at EPA, and they had begun doing work on in late 2015 and had a lot of dialogue with states about how to do that, including with California, which is proceeding to do that independently now of EPA. So in terms of urban air pollution and regional air pollution, there's still more to be done on the motor vehicle side and on the fuel side. But where the real need is the climate issues. Transportation now in this country has become the largest source of greenhouse gases. The regulations that EPA has adopted are starting to turn that curve, but it's a Titanic, to turn that around. Anything you do in the vehicle arena takes about 10 years to have an impact, to turn over the fleet. So we're about halfway through that process, and I'm sure many of you are aware, it's been in the news quite often, that the administration appears about ready to call a halt to that program. They are analyzing about 7 or 8 different options, but the quote preferred option would stop any improvements in greenhouse gases from 2020 on. The other concerning piece of that particular action is they would also like to take away California's authority to do that, which would be a drastic change. The dance between EPA and California over the past 50 years, I just was out in California recently, CARB is celebrating its 50th anniversary. But the choreography between EPA and California has been magnificent and has led to when I say we have the cleanest vehicles in the world, it's EPA and California in tandem that have the cleanest vehicles in the world. And as you know, California has also been the leader in developing ZEV technology, zero emission vehicle technology. And so it seems that the administration has its sights set on trying to take away this authority that was put in the Clean Air Act in 1970, recognizing that California had the worst air pollution at the time, certainly in Los Angeles, still does, but a lot cleaner today. But California also had adopted tailpipe emission standards on cars 2 years before the national government had. So they had an ongoing good program. We're already showing great leadership, and it would be a tragedy, not only for this country, but for the world, if California is taken away from that role. I frankly doubt that that will happen. I know that California is geared up to defend its program. And there are 16 other states and the District of Columbia that have aligned themselves with California, that have adopted the California standards. And those states also will be fighting pretty hard to maintain that independence with California, especially if EPA rolls back the requirements and you have California going this way and EPA saying we're done. That'll be a tough situation. We'll see. That could be the most important from my standpoint, from the motor vehicle standpoint. That could be the most important challenge to the program in the 50 years that this has been in effect. The other couple of kind of what I consider to be crazy rollbacks that are underway. One is what they call the glider trucks. This is where you take some used trucks that have been damaged and you fix them up. And instead of putting a modern engine in that truck, you put an old engine without any particulate filters, without any strong NOx control. EPA has tested a few of those in their Ann Arbor laboratory, and they emit roughly 40 to 50 times as much per kilometer, per mile, as a modern diesel truck. There's only one serious company that makes those vehicles and sells those vehicles, and they happen to have been a strong fundraiser for the president and have been briefing Administrator Pruitt. It looks like Mr. Pruitt would like to eliminate them from the EPA controls under the argument that trailers are not motor vehicles. They don't move, they don't have a motor. But of course you have to think about what's the purpose of the trailer. It's to be part of a tractor-trailer combination. And all EPA is trying to do is regulate the aerodynamics of these trailers. So if they didn't move, you wouldn't worry about the aerodynamics, but you worry about it because they do move. So it's ironic that you have most of the regulated truck industry strongly supports the EPA regulation and oppose relaxing the regulation for trailers. But that does seem to be where we're heading. The other is trying to carve out other aspects of the heavy truck regulation that what we call gliders. Again, these are the older vehicles getting or newer vehicles getting old engines. So you have the trailers on the one side and the gliders on the other. The prospects are not good, frankly, in the short term, I think. And of course, overarching all of this is backing out of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. In spite of the government itself, just about 4 months ago, issuing a scientific report on the state of the art with regard to climate and pointing out that, the last 3 years are the hottest in recorded history. When's the last time we had stage 5 hurricanes, 2 in 1 year? The manifestations of climate change are quite dramatic and just getting worse all the time and getting more widespread. I look at this current situation from the prism of having met Ann Gorsuch at the time that she came to EPA. And I look at the two administrations. Reagan was elected in 1980 really in a landslide. He carried the popular vote by 10%, which is almost unheard of. He had large coattails and brought a lot of people into the Senate and the House. And his mantra was, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And clearly the agenda for Ms. Gorsuch when she came to EPA was to dismantle a lot of the program. And was put together an agenda. At that time, there was work underway on revisions to the Clean Air Act, and a whole package of provisions was put together to relax CO standards, to relax NOx standards, take away the ability to push for inspection and maintenance programs, and a bunch of other things, but those are the ones that stand out to me. And within 2 or 3 years, she was gone, and Bill Ruckelshaus was brought back to EPA to put the agency back together. I think a good reason for that at the time was we had control, I shouldn't say we, the Democrats had control of the House, even though one of the most powerful Democrats, John Dingell, represented the vehicle industry at the time, of course. But Henry Waxman from California was a master legislator and did a very effective job of keeping the feet to the fire. But more importantly, I think, is the Republicans in the Senate they were not the kind of Republicans we talk about today. You had Christie from Rhode Island, Bob Stafford, Senator Baker from Tennessee. I mean, these were environmentalists. Republican moderate were very environmental at that time. And in many ways, I thought of the Senate as a stronger supporter of EPA than the House, even though the House was controlled by the Democratic Party. The situation today, though, is quite a bit different. On the one hand, the president, even though he frequently talks about it as the biggest victory ever, he really squeaked in. He didn't carry the popular vote. He lost that by 3%. But he did win the electoral vote, but by 70 or 80 votes less than Reagan had. But the big difference is at the Congress. He has strong support for the deregulatory agenda, I think, in both the House and the Senate. And we'll have to see how that proceeds. I tend to be an optimist from a couple of standpoints. One, vehicle technology has advanced so much, and I see around the world, and in 1975, we were the first, we meaning US and California, put catalytic converters on cars. Almost 100% of all new gasoline cars today in the world have a catalytic converter. In the Bush era, Bush 2, EPA mandated particulate filters on all new diesel engines, cars, trucks, and started in motion for all of the off-road vehicles as well. And that's now sweeping the world. Every new diesel vehicle in Europe or in China or in India. China and India probably in 2020. They've adopted the regulations, but they're being phased in. But all of Europe, all of Japan, all of Korea, have particulate filters on all of their new diesel vehicles, and there are other technologies like this. So I think the movement toward continuing to improve the technology on vehicles is unstoppable at this point in time, especially if California is surviving. And I was very interested in your comment, Linda, about science, in that I'm sure I'm very naive about this, but I'm relying on science and good science to save us, in that I think it's just going to continue to be harder and harder to ignore climate change. It's just a reality. And as we have more storms and more of the kinds of things that people can see and feel, I think the tendency to just ignore it will get less and less, I think, because it's just a reality. I have a son-in-law who works for NREL, and he's doing a detail for the Department of Defense. And they, in all of their decisions, pay great attention to climate change. They have these multi-million dollar installations that tend to be in the vicinity of ports and in the vicinity of water. And they're making decisions. How are we going to move them back, or how are we going to protect them? And for the next one that we're going to build, how do we account for climate change? He hears sort of just talking to people that they're in their military planning. They're considering, what are we going to do when this water shortage hits this area, and things like that. So the reality for the people that are making, day-to-day decisions, they have to factor climate change in. And I think as a nation, it'll be very hard to ignore that, even if politically we seem to want to do it for a while. And I also believe, perhaps incorrectly, that at the end of the day, the public supports clean air. I think that I always think of it as sort of the mother thing. If your kids start getting more asthma attacks, if you have to go to the hospital with your children for this or that or the other thing, people are going to be asking why. Why aren't we doing more? And we have, 100 million people or so in this country that still live in areas that exceed one or more of the NAAQS air quality standards. So it's still going to be very important going forward. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take questions, and the way that we're going to do this is we have Vic and I think Ingrid, oh, there she is, with microphones, and every third question, I'm going to see if we have questions from the people on the phone.
What?
Okay. I'm not sure what's happening.
Do you want me to?
Sorry.
Okay. Let's start with questions from the audience. Yes, Carl.
Okay, everybody can hear, right? I enjoyed the presentation, that focusing on not as on the problems of the day, but more on what are we going to do about it. I have to say, Linda, I didn't understand or disagree with your statements that EPA has been declining for several years. I think you even said that, and I'm sorry. I'm going to respond to that.
I'm not sure declining in the public's mind, you mean, or what,
Yeah.
the EPA reputation?
Yeah, it was related to EPA reputation. You had said that, and it's rare that anybody would say, "Boy, am I glad EPA's there," when certain things happen. My experience at EPA and since then working in the city government is that EPA is not broken as an organization per se. In fact, I don't think that would be a solution at all. It's unfocused before the current administration. It's unfocused and has been for some time. But my experience has been, and I want to say this, that the solution in the future is in building partnerships with our co-regulators, the state, the people we regulate, particularly those things we regulate that are public utilities themselves, like in water program, that the solution there is to build a partnership much more dramatically, and it's an untold story. In my own experience and people I work with, we have many times where a state would say, "Boy, am I glad EPA helped me out there," or "I'm glad there." We have it all over the place. What we haven't done very well is say that and advertise it. I think it's one of the things we haven't done well. Talking about reorganizing EPA seems ill-founded. I think better would be, let's build EPA back to what it could be with our partners.
Well, I agree with the partnership part a lot. Absolutely. The reputational piece, we've all heard wonderful stories of people talking about where would we be without the work of EPA. I think that my concern is the public isn't speaking to their policymakers. And they are speaking to those policymakers on other things. And I think that is reflected in the fact that we don't have a lot of champions in Washington in the political body. And so I do worry about whether we have the public support at the level it will take to get the funding of EPA where it needs to be, to get some of the environmental statutes reauthorized. I think we have a Congress who doesn't care or is antagonistic to EPA. And I worry that they're reflecting not just their donors, but the public. And that's what I was trying to get to.
This side? Yes. Ingrid, over in the middle.
Thank you. Is this on?
It is.
I'm going to ask a question directed, I suppose, at the scientists. In the last few days, I've read two pieces in the Washington Post. One was about Administrator Pruitt's decree about science and how the agency would no longer be able to base regulatory actions on scientific studies that involved confidential sources of information, such as medical studies. And the point of view of the writers, who I don't recall who they were, was that this would gut all sorts of regulatory programs in the agency. He mentioned in particular Harvard's 6 cities study and how that led to favorable action on controlling particulate air emissions, and this would no longer be possible. And indeed, that particular rule on particulates was likely to be rescinded by the Pruitt administration. And then this morning there was another article written by a man named Robert Hahn, although it did not, I don't know that the mechanics of newspaper production permitted a specific rebuttal of the previous article because they were so close in time. But what he said was there was a lot of rhetoric on this, and we really ought to understand what Pruitt was doing and how it really wasn't such a bad idea. And I took Mr. Hahn to say that the stuff about the Harvard 6 city study was not in fact true. I'm going to ask if there's a scientist here that could tell me, or scientist on the panel could tell me which of these two contentions is the correct one.
I'm not a scientist on the panel.
I'm an engineer, but I follow the science pretty closely in terms of the health effects. And I think the first is what frightens me the most. I think that a lot of the studies, the Harvard 6 city study, and then the taking the analysis and reworking it that was done under the auspices of the Health Effects Institute is really the underpinning of the PM 2.5. There have been other studies. Arden Pope has done some really great work and others, but this was a long-term study which has lots and lots of data, but you cannot go back to the person that was identified to have this particular disease in this city at this particular point in time because of privacy concerns. And so if you take that away, it makes it much, much more difficult to do the kind of really in-depth studies that the 6 city studies was. I thought when you mentioned the second, there was actually a decree that was issued by Administrator Pruitt yesterday, and he would like to take economic impacts into effect in analyzing air quality data and setting health effects, which to my knowledge, to my understanding, is really one of the most important backbones of the Clean Air Act, is that you can take the economics into account when you decide how quickly you could comply with it in a given city or whatever, but health effects should have nothing to do with economics. And it's been one of the drawbacks, I think, in the European program that they're trying to now overcome. And it's one of the really great, the visionary that Senator Muskie and Leon Billings and those people were in 1970 to separate that out and say health studies should have nothing to do with the economy. We deal with the economy when we figure out what we want to do to achieve those health levels, but the health itself shouldn't be an economic issue. And so both of these weaknesses, so-called taking out secret science and adding economic impacts into the analysis of health effects, I think are fundamentally undercutting a lot of the Clean Air Act. And frankly, I'm not a lawyer, but I can't see with the act so clear in this way that the administrator would be able to prevail by bringing cost and economic impacts in.
Okay.
But clearly, he's trying to weaken it.
Thank you. I want to make sure we reach out to the people on the phone. Do we have any questions?
Phyllis, we don't have a question yet from the region.
Okay.
Perhaps they will slip one in.
I'm going to slip one in about, we talk about public trust. We talk about which article do I believe, which one's right. And I know in some of our discussions about the next 25 years, we talked about the importance of how do you educate the public, particularly upcoming generations, about how do you discern between fake news, fake science, real news, and whether you have any thoughts on how do we educate the public so that they're bombarded with a lot of conflicting information, some that's valid science and some that's made up. Any thoughts on how you combat that? I'm looking at Elizabeth first.
Well, I think one of the best ways to combat it is to start with really good education. And I think there are lots of examples of, even in elementary schools, teachers are teaching about this issue, because you're not going to be able to bring back the days when everybody watched CBS News or ABC News, and there was kind of, and those people were trying very hard to be objective, and somehow you could trust that, or maybe you couldn't. But anyway, people did trust what came out of the major news sources. And it's not going to go back to that. We're going to have a cacophony, and that's the only choice that our future will have. And so I think one of the ways that you find who you can trust and you figure out who that is. Unfortunately, people have different ideas about who they can trust, and I think we're going to have to keep going with that. From my perspective as a journalist, one of the things that I think one of the ways I think EPA has failed itself in recent years is that it was scared of itself. And I don't know why. You guys worked at EPA, I didn't. But I found it so frustrating when I would try to write a story about some regulation that EPA was working on, and nobody with real knowledge would talk to me, and I'd have to talk to a flack who knew much less than I did about the policy. And so I would end up having to do stories about EPA's rules that were incredible. And I was working for National Public Radio. Like, everybody would talk to me, but the EPA, would just give me the flack to talk to. And there's some exceptions in the room, including Bob, you. But there were a lot of people who just wouldn't talk. Yeah. But you would talk, and I don't know why EPA would do this, but one of the stories that to me baffled me was EPA's rule that had to do with cutting methane emissions from oil and gas industry. And this is the Obama administration. We're not talking about a Republican administration here. They wouldn't talk to me. I had to basically do the story on my own about EPA's rule. And I think EPA hurt itself, and I don't know why it happened.
Okay, a question from this side of the room, Vic. We'll go over closest to you, I guess.
A question for Ms. Fisher. In your opening remarks, you talked about abuse of science by both sides. And I tend to agree with you, but I'd appreciate if you could expand just a little bit. What were some examples that came to your mind?
Abuse is such a harsh word. We used to joke in the pesticides program that we all wished we'd gotten degrees in sound science. And abuse, I do think maybe not quite the right word, but many of the agency's decisions are really tough, and the science doesn't. And I totally agree with Mike. The blurring or bringing in economics into what I consider true health standard setting is not appropriate. You need to separate that before you do the risk management. I do think that many of EPA's decisions, whether it's around chemicals, I talked about agriculture, biotechnology. We all know that there are a lot of folks who see science differently. That can be a legitimate difference. It can be something that's maybe less legitimate or a bit twisted on either side. But I think the biggest one to me, and I bring my own biases to it, is the whole debate around agriculture biotechnology and that's not, I'm not saying that that's an EPA problem. I'm talking, more about activists. I think activists on both sides tend to want to take the science that supports their view, call it sound, and push it forward. And I do think EPA, all regulatory agencies, although I think EPA and Interior seem to be more of the hotbeds, I think the agency staff is trying to struggle with what is the science, how far does it take you to resolving that environmental question. And they do that with the pressures from both sides. So figuring out how you get very transparent process, how you get the best scientific minds, how you respect the fact that scientists may look at the same data and come to different conclusions, and get those voices in the room in a constructive way and not a destructive way is a challenge. And I think that's something that's, I think the agency absolutely has to stick to the science. I mean, started at the agency working for Lee Thomas, and he used to always say, bring me the science first. Tell me, how close does that get to resolving the issue? That doesn't mean all the scientists are going to look at the same data the same way.
Okay, we're going to take a question from this side of the room. Is this our last question, Chuck?
I've got two questions for the panel. My name is Frans Koch, and I worked at EPA during the Carter administration. The first one is, has anyone looked at the reversibility of what the Trump administration is doing? My impression is that their rulemaking is rather sloppy, and that's why they're in court so much. And so when they do that, and they do it through executive decisions at the Pruitt level, or maybe even somewhat below that, it should be not that difficult to eventually reverse it. And that should give us all hope before we go into the other room and celebrate something. The other question is for Linda. Could you about the problems that you describe, about it, the conflicting ways of scientists looking at the same problem. Can you give some specifics on that? Because I'm a little lost in what you're saying there. So thank you very much for your consideration of this question.
I guess the point I was trying to make, particularly around the current discussion about what Pruitt's doing, what he's done around the Science Advisory Board, the reconstruction of some of those panels. I think the agency traditionally took really tough science questions and threw them to the National Academy. Frequently, we got answers back that were very helpful. Sometimes we got answers back that didn't help us much at all in decision making, right? So I think there has been so much debate about the use of science, which we all know is essential to good decision making, that's an issue that we need to have a much stronger, better public discussion about. How does the agency have current science, keep current with risk assessment processes? How do they exclude science that might not be adequate, may not have the same level of confidence around it? I've got a lot of concerns about some of the public debate, not the agency's decisions around agriculture biotechnology. I think there's been a lot of distortion of the risks of that, right? So that's my personal one. But I can't go through a bunch of just particular science issues and say, here's where I think science got distorted. It's hard for me to believe that folks that have worked in the agency haven't felt the concern on both sides, left or right of center, around scientific discussions.
Okay, let's.
Probably not a good use of everybody's time, but it's clearly an issue that has a lot of people concerned. And so when you have issues like that, I think it's great to get independent panels to look at how do we do it right? Because the goal is to have very strong science-based decisions at EPA, that the public has confidence in the science.
On your first question, I think that many of the things that are underway are not done. And they have to go through a reverse rulemaking process and take public comment and consider what the law actually requires and so forth. So, for example, I think the glider thing is not going to last. I think the trailer thing is not going to last. And perhaps, depending upon the next presidential election, the reversal of the Paris Accord may not last. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to put things back in place, especially if in the motor vehicle area, if California continues to go ahead alone, because it'll force the industry to still do a lot of what needs to be done. And it'll be possible for the national government then to piggyback on that fairly quickly.
I want to thank our speakers. We still have about 10 or 15 minutes of our meeting we have to do, and I know I'm staying, we have the food outside, but I want to thank our speakers for your great presentations and also Oh, did I hit it off? Okay, sorry.
Good evening. It's good to see all of you again. I'm here to tell you about our board of directors and the election that ended this evening with some of you voting, many of you voting electronically. Thank you. Back when Lynn Miller and I came up with this idea of this association, one thing we agreed on was it was going to be a democracy, which means that it's run by the members, and we have a board of directors which is elected entirely by the membership. And in fact, if any person volunteers to run for the board, they are automatically put on the ballot. The board doesn't say, well, we don't think you'd be a good board. No. If you want to help run this organization, we will put you on the ballot. We have a 15-person board, and there are 4 people who are leaving this year that we owe a lot of gratitude to. Dave Calkins, Bharat Mathur, Fran Phillips, and Bob Whalen. I'm happy to say that both Dave Calkins and Bob Whalen, having served as president of the association, in the bylaws, they get to stay on as ex officio members for a couple of years, so we'll still have the benefit of their wisdom. But the people remaining are Phil. I'm telling you this because I want you to input to these people through the years. These are the people who are representing you. So Phil Angel, John Bachman, Candy Broussard, Penny Fenner-Crisp, Phyllis Flaherty, Dave Minotti, Margot Oge, Tom Voltaggio, Mary Louise Ulig, Ingrid Wadsworth, and Stephen Wheel. And we have an election tonight, and it was very close, which shows we had good candidates. And joining the board this year for a 3-year term are Sam Coleman, Elizabeth Anderson, Betty Anderson as we know her, Mark Greenwood, and Derry Allen. So let's give them all a hand. And I'm going to go off script here for just a minute, Phyllis, if you allow me. I'd like to see a show of hands of how many of you have read one or more of the transition updates that come out every week. Will you do me a favor? Steve Wheel, who's the sole editor of that, is on the phone. I would like you to repeat after me, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about our volunteer table. Did you all see that you had, maybe you sat on it, but hopefully not. You had a paper in your chair there. Now, I don't know if any of you saw some of the recent studies that have been coming out that volunteering is good for the brain. There was a recent study this week that people volunteer, especially on a regular basis, their cognitive health scores improve. If they don't volunteer, their cognitive scores decline faster. Other studies show it makes you happier, and others show it prevents dementia. So now I want to tell you about our volunteer opportunities. Candace Broussard and some others worked very hard to put together this flyer. There's a table where if you fill it in, you can drop your form. There's also a couple of people, I think Candy will be out there and Roy Gamsey, to talk about some of the volunteer opportunities. I'm going to just mention a few of them. I chair a committee on working with the EPA, and while things may seem bleak, we do have a working relationship with the EPA, and we recently started a small group mentoring program with OECA managers. And we've had our first one the end of last month, where we had 2 alumni meet with 3 OECA managers for about an hour and a half. We've been, I was told that was very well received, and they're very enthusiastic over it, and we've been asked to do additional mentoring sessions, so I need some volunteers for that. We also do a lot of work related to our half century of progress committee, where we're taking the material from that publication and develop material for use in AP courses. And we now have members that are going out to high schools to actually teach some of that material and answer questions, and they're looking for a lot of volunteers in that area. Chuck would like to see this expanded to colleges, so there may be another opportunity. And earlier this week, you should have gotten an email inviting you to participate on some focus groups related to a project on future directions for EPA and environmental protection. We're working with American University Center for Environmental Policy, invited us to partner with them. A big thanks to alumni Dan Fiorino for doing this. He's director of the center, and I see John Reeder at the back of the room who's working with us. And right now we're in the middle of a major effort to set up these focus groups with the eye towards developing a survey questionnaire that will go out to all 1,700 plus alumni members to tap your vast experience and expertise so that we can contribute to the dialogue on the future of environmental protection. This effort will culminate in a conference in 2019 at American University. We've talked to a lot of alumni, and there's a lot of excitement over this project because there's a really great need now to think about, okay, what's next for EPA? What's next for environmental protection? Is there a way we can help contribute to that dialogue? There's also other great opportunities. We have a job center. I think as of today, there are like 57 jobs posted on that job center. This was an effort originally. Chuck came up with the idea that we needed to provide some help to those EPA employees that might be leaving the agency, either because of retiring or other reasons. So anyway, there's a lot of good opportunities. I think you can see them listed on the back of the sheet. We tried to specify which ones are sort of you only need a couple hours, you only need 5 hours or whatever, because we know some people want to volunteer on an ongoing basis, but some have lots of vacation plans and grandchildren coming for the summer and may want to just, volunteer for an hour or two. But I really encourage you to do it. And I want to thank you for coming. And I don't know if, Chuck, you have any last comments before I tell them go enjoy the food, the wine, and the company, and have a great time. Thank you. Food is just outside the door.